Hear me?
Yeah, go ahead, Sarah.
Oh, fabulous. I am joining this from my car, so if I cut out, let me know. But my name is Sarah Grace. My pronouns are she and they. I am a graduate student at the University of South Carolina, so that is where I am right now. The heat, honestly, down here is pretty average. The humidity, though, is pretty abysmal. So although it's about 96 degrees right now, I do feel like I'm swimming. Uh, so I'm sorry to hear about everything that's being caused to folks up north.
Mm.
Totally. Yeah. Oh, go ahead.
Yeah, hi, I'm sorry. My name is Xinrui and I'm now in Chicago and the temperature is about 80 degree, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. Awesome. Thank you all for chiming in. I'm so glad to hear where everyone's from. It's really interesting. And Sarah, I'm from Columbia, so I understand the humidity. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce Mark, and then we'll have, 30, 35 minutes. And then please also jot down or put in the chat any questions you have during his presentation. And then we can have some good conversation at the end. So Mark A. Yarhouse, and I hope I pronounced that right. He's a Psy.D, and he is the Dr. Arthur P. Rech and Miss Jean May Rech Professor of Psychology at Wheaton College, where he directs the Sexual and Gender Identity Institute. Mark's primary area of research is the intersection of religious identity and sexual or gender identity. In 2015 and again in 2022, Mark served as a consensus panel He served on a consensus panel convened by the APA to provide recommendations to SAMHSA on services to LGBTQ+ youth. He has also been a subject matter expert and consultant to the National Institute of Corrections for the care of LGBTQ+ persons in adult and juvenile corrections. Mark has served as chair of the Division 36 Task Force on LGBTQ+ issues from 2013 to 2025. So happy Pride to everyone, and I'll pass it over to you, Mark.
All right. Thank you so much for the introduction, and Connie for just suggesting a webinar and just a way to sort of recognize the work of the task force. So it's a delight to be able to do that. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen so I can do the PowerPoint and see if this is that working well? Good. Okay. So I titled this From Division to Dialogue, just kind of playing on the word of any division in APA, and but also to recognize that I think historically there has at times been some wariness between different divisions, particularly Division 44 and Division 36, with different people either having assumptions or wondering what those different people thought, and some of the, I think, siloing maybe within our divisions to kind of do our work. And I know that Division 36 is quite expansive in its representation across religions and no religion. The focus is the scientific study of religion and spirituality.
Mr. Beasley.
But at the same time, a number of members of Division 36 are also part of more institutions that are more traditional, as like Christian institutions or other institutions. And sometimes that has caused some either misunderstandings or disagreements or some challenges across divisions or maybe assumptions across divisions. And so I want to talk a little bit about how we went from maybe a sense of division to greater dialogue. So in 2013, the Division 36 Executive Committee appointed a task force on LGBTQ issues. I was invited by then President of Division 36, Elizabeth Hall, to serve as the chair of that task force. So from what I understood from talking to Liz at the time was that she had had a really good and just a positive um, communications with the president at that time of Division 44, and they found themselves just really appreciating and kind of like maybe breaking through some of the maybe misgivings that have historically been there and some of the questions that may have historically been there. And they seem to have achieved it more out of the relationship with each other, the dialogues they were having in another venue. And so she shared a little bit of that with me, and it was the impetus for the idea of a task force within 36 on LGBTQ issues. And I realize issues is probably, I don't know that we knew the best way to even frame a task force because, of course, we don't reduce the complexities of the experiences of sexual minorities and gender diverse people to issues. Maybe in hindsight, we would have thought of another creative way to engage that topic, um, but it was born out of that dialogue, born out of the desire to improve communication and relationships, and just to attend to the experiences within our own division. And so now I should also say though that a number of the tensions have arisen more from some of the institutions or perceptions of institutions that are more traditional or more conservative. Um, and so one of the questions was then, do you have members of the task force that represent those to sort of go to those hard topics, those hard places, and see what dialogue could look like there? So my recollection is there was an announcement posted to the listserv about it, and people were invited. I think the main person who came from the listserv directly was Mark Brennan Ing, and others maybe were a little less maybe I have the background here is the excitement of being on a task force, maybe less excited to be on the task force. And so I approached some people. I knew Ward Davis. At the time, I was at Regent University. I've only been at Wheaton about 6 years, but Ward was at Wheaton, and I knew that he was doing research in this area, and he's very conversant within Division 36 and was already sort of modeling dialogue with people in 44. And so I approached him. I had been doing work with Janet Dean and thought that she would be a great dialogue partner in this space. William Hathaway, Bill Hathaway is probably the most senior person we had on the task force when it began. And he was, he had served in APA governance. He had been a past president of 36. So he sort of knew the governance and the workings of APA better than any of the rest of us, and was kind of a senior voice, and thought he would be a good addition. Stephen Stratton had also collaborated with me and with Janet on some things, and I thought that I knew his tone and way of relating would lend itself to the kind of dialogues we were hoping to have at some point. Teresa Tisdale would join later. I think it's about 2020. I may get that off by a year or so, but Barbara Lowe would also join 2023, Kenny Boyd and David O'Connor as a student member in 2024. So they didn't have quite as much time within the task force, but began with the six of us, and then Teresa was added a little bit later, and then others. And that was really by people who were, especially Teresa, for example, she was coming to the dialogues that I'll talk about in a little bit. She was very active in this, was drawn to them and really saw the value of it. And then just kind of as a natural next step was wondering, can I just, serve in the task force capacity? So that was great. So the mission of the task force, we've always kind of laid it out this way that there are these, there's actually 3 on this screen and 2 more on the next one, but really wanted to increase and disseminate scientific knowledge on the intersections among religion, spirituality, sexual identity, gender identity, and basic applied research on religion and spirituality among sexual and gender minorities, and then promote education and training at that intersection, clinical psychology of religion and spirituality, and the and psychological practice with sexual and gender minority clients, raise awareness of, enhance cultural responsiveness to the experiences, concerns, and welfare of sexual and gender minority persons, particularly those who do identify as religious or spiritual, and then support the professional development of Division 36 members who identify as sexual or gender minority or both, and then foster relational connections, research collaborations, respectful dialogues between 36 members and members of the Division 44. Looking back on it, I would say that our strength, maybe where we seem to do better, was probably the very first one on disseminating scientific knowledge through symposia at APA and then published works. And then this relational connection piece that I have up on the slide right now. I would say those were probably the two of the five that were probably the most, we felt like we got the most traction maybe. And maybe next would be the education and training promotion through the symposia and things like that. I'll give an example later of a pre-conference training that was done by one of our dialogue partners. And so there were things like that that were a little more clinical, applied training, educational. Maybe that, and then next, maybe raising awareness and cultural responsiveness to experiences of sexual and gender minorities, religious sexual and gender minorities. And maybe I think the area that was the greatest area for growth, that was always challenging, is how to support the professional development of Division 36 members who self-identify as sexual or gender minorities. I think what I found over time is that my experience was that most of the self-identified sexual and gender minorities in 36 were also part of 44. And it's not always the case. That may not, I may have misread that. But for a while there, for several years, we were discussing as a task force and in dialogue with 44 what mentorship could look like for existing members to mentor student members. And, what would that look like if a student member was a sexual or gender minority, but was in 36, was passionate about studying psychology of religion and spirituality, but didn't have a mentor for that. And so I think the question that kept coming up is, wouldn't those folks overlap really significantly across divisions? And that was an ongoing question. And then would students be seeking mentorship here, or would they be seeking mentorship in 44? And 44 already had a very well-developed mentorship program. Now, informally, I did have a number of students, for example, that I had mentored, particularly when I was at Regent, but also now at Wheaton, who were sexual minorities, who volunteered to be mentors now as they graduated from their doctoral degree, and knew, more recent graduate, knew kind of the challenges of going through graduate school as a sexual or gender minority and studying the psychology of religion and spirituality. So and particularly they were at more traditionally conservative institutions where there may be more challenging things to navigate. And so at an informal level, there was that mentoring available, but it never really developed into maybe the scope of what it could have been. And I think when I look back, I think that's an area that I wish we could have worked out a little bit better, but be that as it may, that's kind of where things were. And I've talked about the Division 44 a little bit. So when we started the 36 task force, Division 44, because of the dialogue that Liz Hall had with the president of 44 at the time, they set up an initiative to have a task force on religion and spirituality. So that was kind of interesting. That was kind of both divisions set up task force that would kind of overlap with each other. And so this task force was launched and co-chaired by Kathleen Ritter and Aaron Denicky. And then the way we approached it is we decided that we would meet at each of the annual conventions and try to meet in our respective hospitality suites. And so Division 36 Hospitality Suite would host an hour-long dialogue and invite this Division 44 task force on religion and spirituality to join and be part of that discussion with us, and we would be dialoguing with each other. And then they would host an hour, and we would go to theirs, and they would host that time. Now, that task force, just to fast forward now several years, would eventually become a committee and is now co-chaired by Darren Freeman Coppage, Jeffrey Paulez, and Danny Rosenkrantz, who were kind of younger members of the dialogue some 13 years ago or whatever, 12 years ago. And so that's been kind of neat to see kind of the senior people. In 44, they would call them elders. So Kathleen Ritter, Aaron Deneke were referred to as elders of Division 44. And as they kind of handed the baton, it went to Darren and Jeff and Danny. I think at least Darren and Danny were students at the time that this began. I'm not sure about, I can't remember if Jeff was at the time, but so it was kind of, I think they did a nice job of kind of bringing students up the way that that's an area that I wish we had done a little bit better. We had a student member at the end, but never the kind of full, robust vibrancy of student members that would have been a really nice addition, I think. Okay, so that's a little bit on the relationship with the task force. These conversation hours, let me mention a little bit more about that. I think that was the most unique aspect of our work together and maybe the most surprising and fulfilling. Because kind of like what Liz Hall experienced in her dialogue one-on-one, I think people who entered into this space were generally, I would describe as like good faith dialogue partners who really wanted to understand the other. And so rather than kind of othering one another, there was much more of a desire to sort of help me understand. So there's a lot of, introductions of ourselves and our background and the challenges we faced. I remember one of the very first dialogues, might have been the first one or second one, a number of people were talking about how being a sexual or gender minority in religious spaces were really difficult for them. And it was kind of going that direction pretty significantly. And then one of the task force members who had studied at a state university as a conservative Christian shared about how it was really challenging being a Christian in that space, and that a lot of decisions made about how forthright to be about being a Christian and what that could look like, and would people think differently of them or their capacity to do research, or to be unbiased in their approach to data analysis and things like that. So it was very interesting because it kind of shifted the conversation towards it's possible to be in difficult spaces, and of course we're not making comparisons saying it's just the same at all. That was part of the value of these dialogues, was to not do that, but to realize that some of the challenges in different spaces existed obviously for sexual and gender minorities in conservative religious spaces, but also for conservative religious people in secular spaces. And so that was an interesting part of the conversation that I think kind of opened a door to greater cognitive complexity, greater perspective taking. And then now you have to understand that this was happening for, by the fifth year, people were, greeting each other, hugging each other. It's so good to see you again. Like, and then you go to a decade, it was, some of the people were there the entire time. Others, would join later and be added to that. Others had to step away. At a very practical level, each of the task forces, we would host and then set the agenda for our hospitality time. And usually as task force chairs, we would discuss a little bit about kind of what we wanted to talk about. Sometimes it would be related to a symposium that we had presented on. So maybe we would dialogue afterwards if we could and kind of process it. Maybe we would dialogue before because of the nature of the schedule, and we would just discuss a topic that was important to people from the year before. And then later, some years we maybe didn't have a hospitality suite. We would just meet for lunch. Other times, COVID, we met online. So there were just other variations of this that happened that were challenging. But I think the greatest challenge was the tension between depth of relationships for people who returned and were invested and were continuing, the tension between that and expansion, because we always wanted to say everyone is welcome. We would announce it, we would want people to come, but you could imagine coming to that space for the first time, you would be perhaps curious, wary. How is this working? Is this safe emotionally? What would this be like? I think that was the way everyone who had been doing it for 5+ years felt the first year. So it made sense that whenever you had new people coming, and every year we had new people coming, there was this sense of like, okay, we've got to go back to remembering what it was like the first time we were here, and how do we bring people in and catch people up and sort of, acknowledge the curiosity, the questions, maybe the skepticism. There were interesting times, when you try to expand. So I think that always felt like, okay, are we going deeper? Are we expanding? It's hard to do both, and yeah, I think that was an ongoing challenge. I think a few things we learned. I think we learned to not assume uniformity in belief or experience. The example I gave a little bit earlier might illustrate that, of different people's experiences in different spaces, and whether to be more forthcoming about religious identity or about sexual or gender identity. I think use of terms like conservative or traditional or affirming, what's the right terms to use, and being thoughtful and precise about that. Um, Allowing for theological diversity and nuance, and just recognizing the limits that psychology in and of itself cannot adjudicate complex theological issues. It can speak to, the psychological correlates and other associations, and perhaps the effects of certain experiences on people. But it really couldn't weigh in on the specifics of an actual theological position. Just was beyond the competence of the members, really. We were psychologists and we were not theologians, by and large. I think a phrase that came up early, and I don't know if it was Steve Stratton or Kathleen Ritter or both, but this phrase came up quite a lot, was to learning how to sit with uncertainty. When we talked, especially about client care, Steve had run a counseling center at Asbury University. Kathleen Ritter had been in practice for years, and again, was an elder of 44. And being able to kind of sit with uncertainty when we talked about how to best care for our clients or advocate for our clients, and some of the, what they might want to do, how they hold their religious identity and their sexual identity, or their religious identity and their gender identity, and how that holding would be. So that was a phrase that Steve remembered we talked about from the very beginning, and was kind of a phrase that came up for many years. Now, I mentioned Kathleen Ritter. She was an elder, co-chair of the Division 44's Task Force on Religion and Spirituality. She passed away actually in 2019, and this, I think, deeply impacted both task forces. I think we all loved Kathleen and just thought, here was a kind of a senior statesman. And I think for me, Kathleen had one of the most disarming conversations I had with her, because she had read an article I wrote. It was something like being a round peg in a square hole, working as an evangelical in LGBTQ studies. It was some kind of title like that. And she found that to be such a fascinating title, and she wanted to talk to me about it. And it was one of those conversations that didn't have a preconceived, outcome to it. I think she was genuinely curious about it. I think she was actually a respondent to the article when it was first published, and it surprised her, and I think it left her very curious. And we had just a great conversation about that. And she herself shared that she was Catholic, and so faith was an important part of her life as well. But there were challenges in being Catholic and being an advocate as she was for the LGBTQ community. And so we had just really, that just brought a lot to the dialogues that we had. And when she passed away, she and Aaron were kind of passing the baton to the younger folks in 44 to lead. But yeah, it was a real um, kind of took the wind out of us sails for a lot of us who cared for Kathleen, but I think also brought us together and a greater sense of cohesion. Like there's this common humanity, and we've seen it even to the end of life. And so that was a very powerful moment, I think, for everyone. So that was the hospitality suite, and I think the most unique aspect of the task force, which doesn't show up in publications or presentations, but was just logging a lot of time investing in relationship and creating and trying to be good faith dialogue partners with one another. But we did do proposals. We tried almost every year to put something forward for the convention. Typically, a topic would come up in our dialogues. Not always, but for the most part, those things would come up. We would discuss it as a task force, which would be the most timely topic, which would be the most feasible. Of course, who's going to co-chair? I think the ideal was we would have a co-chair from each of the task forces, and they would work on the proposal together, and we would sort of brainstorm people who could make contributions. And those folks could be in the task force, they could be beyond the task forces. We just wanted to find the right people to make presentations in the symposia proposals we would put forward. So the co-chairs would rotate typically throughout the different task forces and then settle on those and work on the proposal. So I'm just going to share a couple of slides of just some highlights of, this is not maybe the easiest thing to read, but just some highlights of some of the programming. I don't think it's everything, but I bolded the titles of them, like integrating identities, spirituality, religion, sexuality. That word integrating or the intersection or, that comes up a lot in our titles. You can kind of see that. In our second one, it was a dialogue on religion, spirituality, sexual orientation, and gender identity. And this featured a lot of more senior people like Judith Glassgold, Kathleen Ritter, Doug Haldeman, who was a past president of 44, Elizabeth Hall, past president of 36. And so these were, that was a real nice reaching out, maybe beyond our task forces, to people who were really prominent in the divisions. And, Doug had run for APA president. So, he was a very prominent APA figure. And we realized, I think, quickly that we were focusing on sexual identity and not as much on gender identity. So we would work on a session on transgender and gender nonconforming identities, religion and spirituality, and we had two different co-chairs for that. Then we had one on sexual minority student experiences and faith-based higher education. Probably one of the most challenging symposia that we did get accepted and hosted, and it was, I think feels to a lot of us like a vulnerable population. I think both sides felt kind of protective of the people, the students we're talking about, to some extent, the institutions were understood differently. So that was sometimes as an aside, sometimes people, I don't know if you've ever gone to something called like a difficult dialogue, but a lot of times I go to difficult dialogues and like the topic is difficult, but kind of everybody agrees and they are talking about a topic that's difficult. I think a true difficult dialogue, at least the kind that I think have been the most challenging and perhaps the most rewarding, is when it's a difficult dialogue precisely because people see the topic differently and they're invited into that space and trying to understand one another. And I think this symposium was more like that. Kathleen Ritter did a pre-conference session on more the clinical work that she was doing with people in this space. I think I ultimately had hoped that we would do some pre-conference clinical training together across our task forces. So that never came to fruition, but I think that would have been a really interesting development and a good development of mutual trust and respect and appreciation. Um, uh, Ward and Aaron did one on the role of humility, which was broader than our dialogue, but our dialogue was kind of a case study in humility and um, civility in these conversations. And so there was a lot more to that with other experts being brought in. So that was a really interesting symposium as well. And then Ward and Tyler Lefevre did one on the religious and spiritual lives of sexual minorities. This is more recent. And then Danny and Darren did one more recently that was more on a liberation approach to affirming spaces. And so I don't have all the participants under each of these. The slides got crazy busy. They're already a little busy. But so again, you'd have like 2 or 3, papers being given in the symposium, and they were different people, usually from the task force, but could be from outside expertise that the task force didn't represent at that point. Also want to highlight a couple of things. We had some publications. Probably the highlight for me was really a neat moment where I'd been invited to edit a special section on advances in the intersection of psychology of religion, spirituality, and LGBTQ studies for our division journal. And so that was really an exciting time. And this was meant to be more basic science. And then at the same time, the Spirituality and Clinical Practice Journal had heard about that and asked, could we do a special issue as well on the clinical developments at the intersection of religious and spiritual experiences? So it felt odd to me, giving all these conversations and dialogue, to just be the editor, special, guest editor of this. So I counter-proposed, could I invite a co-guest editor from Division 44 that people I've worked with to do this together? And that was approved. And I invited Doug Haldeman, who I mentioned had, run for APA president, was president of Division 44. And he and I co-guest edited this one for Psychology of Religion and Spirituality. And then Erin Denicky and I co-guest edited the special issue on clinical developments. And she was a terrific clinician, and I knew she was a great dialogue partner and had done a lot of editing before. So that was a really neat experience for me. And actually, Erin, by this time, I had actually was giving a workshop in Pennsylvania near where she lived, and she came to the workshop. Unbeknownst to me, I'm just setting up, about to go, and there I see Erin this is kind of a typical audience for me would be a little bit more of a conservative Christian audience interested in these topics. And she came to hear what I would be like as a speaker, because she knew me as a dialogue partner, but she always wondered, like, what are they like when they're with their tribe? Are they the same as when they're with me? And it was such a good experience from my end, because I did the kind of talk I would normally do. And she was very appreciative of it and just saw a lot of kind of Venn diagram overlap between, how she works as a clinician with religious sexual minorities and how I work as a clinician with religious sexual minorities. And just a lot of trust was built, a lot of good conversations came out of that. And I give her all the credit, because she chose to come to something that was, probably not something that she had planned for that evening, and decided to go to that. And that was really great. A few other sample collaborations. This is not everything by a long stretch, but I just wanted to show you some other ones that were publications. I can just see task force members from both groups in each of these lists of authors. Ward Davis was probably our most prolific writer within the task force, and he's kind of all over these things. Tyler Lefevre also very active. And so and as I mentioned, Ward was already doing a lot of that dialoguing and collaborating, and Tyler's a great collaborator. And So these projects are just good examples, I think, of folks doing work across the task forces in a very positive, collaborative way. Lee Beckstead he was a less frequent visitor to the dialogues, but he had been a good dialogue partner for many, many years. He's more in 44, and he had been working on a very ambitious writing project that I don't know how long it took. I want to say 8 years maybe, but it was a dream of his to write these books, and I have them here. And I was a co-editor on these books, but a number of the division task force members on both divisions were authors, and they were all every chapter was co-authored by multiple authors. It was an editor's nightmare, I would say, to try to make that all come together into one voice. And but he pulled it off. All the credit in the world. He did a great job pulling people together and just really trying to live out the scholarship that was relational and respectful, and really nice job with that. So what are the future directions? I ended up, I do a report every midwinter and every end of the year or at convention, and I summarize what we've been working on, and I talk about the things we've done. And this last time around, I said, I think we may have accomplished what we were hoping to accomplish. I think we've built the relationships, but I see with 44 moving more to a committee, they maybe have their own agenda and working towards goals that they want to do, and which is great. But I don't think it's the same as where we were with the initial building relationships. Those relationships are there. We're basing a lot on them. We're working collaboratively, but the task force's task may have come to completion. And so the executive committee looked at that, and I think felt that made sense to them as well. And it was sundown after 12 years. And that's a long time for any task force, just to be clear about that. So I think, obviously opportunities remain for relationship building and viewpoint diversity, constructive engagement across genuine differences. A lot of overlap in areas that people agree and want to advocate for psychology and its understanding religion and spirituality in the lives of sexual and gender minorities. And so I think that can continue to occur within our division and across divisions in fruitful and healthy ways. So I'm gonna go ahead and bring this to a close, and we'll open it up for some questions.
Thank you so much. What
You're
an
welcome.
incredible presentation, and also just congratulations on so many years of really spectacular work. I'll go ahead and just invite anyone, if you have a question, raise your hand, unmute yourself, feel free to jump in. Yeah, go ahead.
Yes.
Yeah, I'm so sorry I arrived late. I was out with some friends and I rushed back. So although I missed, 95% of your presentation, Mark, I just want to commend you. That task force run of 12 years, that must set some sort of record in our division. Honestly, I mean, I don't know of any task force. I've been around for a long time. I don't know of any task force that has lasted that long. And I do know that you've been really reliable and conscientious with your reports. So I wanted to commend you for that and for making a difference. Two, I wanted to ask you a question about the difference in publications in our division journal, Psychology, Religion, and Spirituality, and also in other leading journals in the psych of religion. I mean, this is something that probably a psych info search could confirm empirically, but is it your sense that the field has seen a significant increase in published research on sexual minorities in our field of psychology, religion, and spirituality?
Yes. I mean, yeah, Tyler Lefevre's work in particular, Ward Davis, they're collaborators, but they do their own lines of research as well. And I would say that, yeah, there's been, I think, quite a bit. Those are two names that come to my mind right off the bat. But um, when we did the special section and the special issue, it was clear that a lot of people were thinking about these issues. It was, whenever you do that, you're putting out a call, you're hoping someone's working on it at this moment. And a lot of people were working on it at that moment. And so that tells me that they were working on these things anyway. So I think maybe one thing to think about is whether it's, you asked, is it coming out of psych of religion? That's a good question. Because some of it might be coming out of more of the scientific study of the experiences of sexual and gender minorities, and then looking at religion as a variable from that reference point. Psychology of religion study might be, framed differently, looking at sexual orientation, gender diversity. So how that sets up in the front end, I don't know that there's quite as much that's directly coming out as psych of religion, but I think what's coming up is more than was coming up before. So that is increasing. But I'd have to do that search you mentioned to see if more people are coming from more of a LGBTQ studies and then looking at religion and spirituality, in which case I think our division has a lot to offer about how to study religion and spirituality that might not always be covered in divisions that have their own expertise.
I want to say that our division is changing dramatically demographically.
Hmm.
Longtime members know that APA gave us data some years ago showing that Division 36 was significantly older, whiter, and more male and more
Mm.
Christian
Mm.
than APA in general. That is changing dramatically. And anyone who's attended the past couple of mid-year conferences sees how young, how diverse.
Mm.
And one of the reasons why young really matters is, Mark, as you know, and perhaps everybody else on the call knows, that the young generation is far more likely to identify as non-heterosexual,
Mhm.
far more likely than any other generation. It's over 20%.
That's right.
And nationally, I think it's more like 7% across the entire. So it's just interesting. I've thought about how, as the demographics of any field changes, how the questions that people ask and the research topics they study also change as a function
Mhm.
of those demographic changes. And so I just wonder if we're going to see kind of the normalizing, if you will, or the continuous move into mainstream of research on these populations and by these scholars, as they're just, the odds are that our field is
Yeah.
going to be more inclusive of those people. And I think that's really a wonderful thing.
Yeah, that's a good point.
I can jump in if no one else has a question right now. One of my other positions, I work with the Gen Z cohort of the Bible for Normal People, which is a podcast bringing like biblical scholarship to normal people. And I see this kind of question between people who grew up evangelical or in really, kind of intensely religious households who are now figuring out that that's not working for them, of whether they just leave the church entirely or they deconstruct and then reconstruct. And I think all of that is definitely heightened when you bring in, coming out or coming into a sexual identity or a gender identity. So I'm just curious if you have seen like what kind of where those trends are going of leaving versus staying, and any insights into what that looks like these days.
Yeah. Yeah, a lot of the literature there is kind of on maybe different responses to that tension people feel, the conflict people feel. And so one is to kind of jettison their upbringing and say, I want nothing to do with that, and they kind of leave everything. Um, I don't think that's quite as common as either deconstructing faith and then deconstructing, or identifying more with spirituality in a broader way than organized religion. So organized religion, it tends to be um, the location where some of that the conflict and negative experiences have been cited. And so or doctrinal positions that they find untenable today. And so they sometimes pursue more general spirituality versus the maybe traditional religion. Of course, there are many, religions and denominations that would embrace LGBTQ people in a more affirming posture than maybe perhaps what they grew up with. And so that's always on the table as well. And that could be the result. They could pursue that as a result of deconstruction and reconstruction, just finding those spaces that they believe they could flourish in. And then others, they stay within the traditional denominations that they were raised in, and either they believe in accordance with the teachings of that faith tradition. It's a part of their own meaning-making structure and belief, or they stay because they want to bring about change within that system. So.
I appreciate your thoughts on that. And I had sort of a follow-up both on this question and then also on something shared earlier. So I'm in the process of writing a dissertation about the experiences of transgender individuals in Christian spaces, whether in their upbringing and deconstruction and leaving the church, or in their remaining within the church or finding Christianity later in life. And one of the things that you had shared had been an important part of the dialogues that had been hosted over the course of several years was language and conversation around the idea of affirmation. And I was wondering if you could share a little bit more about that, both because of my own personal curiosity about the different takes on how these ideas are understood, but also from the perspective of someone who's spending a lot of time thinking about this, digging into the literature as it relates to a larger project. But I appreciate very much this conversation.
Yeah, so the precision around language, yes. And I don't know if Steve, if you want to chime in, I don't want to put you on the spot, but you have been on the task force since day one. But you know, um, I think what we tried to avoid was the either or, that you're either affirming or you're non-affirming. And I think that framing can often polarize dialogue pretty quickly and make it stifle dialogue. So, can you affirm people? Can you be affirmational of so much of the person, even in more conservative traditional spaces, that would be described as non-affirming by a number of people? And so what does it mean? If in some ways I think there were people in the dialogues who felt like the term was so loaded with a certain set of assumptions. And of course, it's ubiquitous, it's used everywhere. And none of us want to be non-affirming. That's not the the framing any of us have. I don't think any of us on any of the task forces felt like they were non-affirming. But what does it mean to be affirming, and what does it mean to be in different spaces with different beliefs? Was a challenging thing to work out. So sometimes, talking through what does that word mean was a fruitful conversation, and just realizing the limits of language, and people seeing each other's hearts and care. And particularly, I think the common thread was typically care for our clients. Like when most of us were clinicians as well, and that's not everybody, but many were in the dialogues. And so when you real world in your clinic meeting with LGBTQ people of faith, I think all of us were as affirmational as we can be within different settings, even though the word might have limitations and imbued with meanings that not everyone shared exactly. So that was, I think some of us moved away from certain terms that could be too loaded for good dialogue, and others held on to them and found them really useful. Steve, did you have any thoughts about that?
I was remembering a conversation we had. I think it was APA in San Francisco back some time ago, and I just remember the hospitality suite conversation in Division 44, where there were two members of Division 44 that were talking about this issue of affirmation, the word, the term, and I still remember the conversation because it launched it derailed what we were going to talk about and launched this great discussion because. This one person lived in San Francisco, talked about a church that he was a part of and really appreciated and considered it. You know, he said, if you want to go to an affirming church, this would be the one that you ought to visit while you're here. Another colleague said, I know that church, and that's not a church that I could get married in to a same-sex partner, and therefore it is not an affirming church. And so there was this wonderful discussion that kind of got launched in this because they were not an adversarial, but they were realizing, wow, when we say affirmation, it's more idiosyncratic than it is a specific term that we need to do. Because the person's response to it was, well, it's affirming to me, and it was this wonderful kind of issue about language and thinking about some of these things together. And we began to realize that language is really important in defining terms, but even terms we're using all the time may be broader and less about. I mean, we got to be careful about what we're communicating with it because we don't know what we're communicating when we say affirming, even within the context of Division 44 at that time, as they were looking at it. So it was a fascinating opportunity to learn, just in the middle of that moment.
Yeah. Thanks.
Sarah, I don't know if that makes any sense with regard to your question, but that was.
Yes, absolutely. And I think a lot of these points too are really helpful for my own like clarifying of one, like some of the ideas that have been coming up myself, but also my participants have shared some of these same ideas. So thank you very much for your perspectives and the language that you're lending to it too. I think this will be very helpful as I think more about these ideas.
Thanks. Thank you.
Can I follow up with Sarah? Sarah, is your work qualitative?
Yes, it is. Yeah. I have collected data from 20 participants who identify as transgender, non-binary, or gender non-conforming.
And I just ask because, you know, Steve, what you're saying about language, it's really dangerous to make assumptions about what words mean, especially words that we throw around all the time and that are seemingly very important. And I think qualitative work is absolutely necessary to find out what people mean. And we really might be surprised. You know, I think in the history of our field, almost 30 years ago now, you know, there were intense debates about the psychology of religion and spirituality. You know, so what the hell do we mean by spirituality? And for those who've been around a long time know that when the society voted to change the name to the Psychology of Religion and Spirituality, and then the journal name, which Ralph Piedmont launched, I think in 2008, 2009, there's a lot of debate. There's still debate about what spirituality means and how it's distinct. So I just point to, you know, the real, like the fundamental need to get an understanding of how people are using terms. Yeah. So anyway, Sarah, good luck with your research.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you all so much.
I think we're reaching the end of our time. Just noticing it just hit 9 p.m. So let's leave it there, but thank you all for the really incredible insights, and especially thank you, Mark, for all the work you've done and for this wonderful presentation. A big round of applause.
You're welcome.
For, you know, unmuted. I'm going to stop the recording, but this will be posted on the Division 36 website soon. So you're all welcome to share it with your colleagues and friends. And thanks again, Mark.
Yeah,
You're
thank
welcome.
you, Mark, so much. We